vote was 4-1 against. Freed from its pledge, the government still didn't introduce conscription. The summer of 1944 brought intense fighting in Normandy and Italy, and the replacement pools of volunteers were empty. Since 1940, Canadians had been called up to work in home defense. These men were known as zombies. Those in favor of conscription demanded some of them be sent to fight overseas. Facing a revolt from pro-conscription members of his government, King reluctantly agreed, and despite the opposition of Quebec, Parliament voted to send 15,000 conscripts overseas. There were riots in Montreal and revolts among the conscripts, but by the time they sailed for Europe, the Canadian section of the front had become quiet. Few conscripts were killed or wounded. Once again, as in the First World War, Canada had resorted to conscription. Once again, the nation was divided, and once again, conscription had little military effect. There was an ugly side to Canada which showed during the war as well. People of German and Italian backgrounds were harassed. One of the least justifiable acts was the internment of Japanese Canadians. Despite the opinion of the Army, the Navy, and the RCMP that they posed no threat to Canada, the Japanese Canadians were rounded up and shipped to the interior. Their fishing boats, homes, and businesses were sold off for ridiculously small amounts. Over 26,000 Japanese Canadians were moved from the Pacific coast to primitive camps deep in the interior, where they led hard lives and were all but forgotten by the rest of Canada. Many of these people, including whole families, were Canadian citizens and were born and raised here. They had done nothing wrong and broken no laws. The policy of internment was fueled by anti-Japanese propaganda, and few Canadians objected to the fact that tens of thousands of their fellow citizens were held in what were virtually concentration camps. The war brought enormous social and economic change to Canada as well. The Depression had meant too many people and not enough jobs. The war turned that situation on its head. Suddenly, there were more jobs than workers. With many men away fighting, women flocked to fill their places in the factories, shops, and offices. It was made illegal for able-bodied men to drive taxis, sell real estate, brew beer, or make sporting goods. The wide-scale employment of women in responsible and demanding positions created a major change in social attitudes. 500,000 women worked directly in war production. More than 50,000 Canadian women joined the armed forces during the war.
A lot of the women who married during the war and were without children didn't really feel married. And we very seldom made very much plans for the future. We lived very much for the present and now. And we didn't discuss too much about when the war is over. It just seemed to be a presence that we had to cope with.
War brought shortages and rationing of food and fuel, and some things like tropical fruit and nylon stockings were virtually unobtainable. As in any wartime economy, a black market developed, but overall the Canadian people followed the rules and avoided profiteering. Some of the social and political changes taken during the war were far-reaching. Unemployment insurance was introduced in 1940, partly in expectation of another depression when the war ended and the troops returned. It marked a major shift in direction in Canada. This attitude was reflected in many ways. New radical political parties sprang up. Trade unions also became stronger during the war. With labor scarce, the threat of a strike was a powerful tool. The unions wanted the right to organize and to negotiate with employers on the behalf of their workers. To avoid a crisis, the government had to accept their proposals. King and his Liberal government could see the change in the public mood and, despite misgivings, adapted to it. In 1918, returning soldiers got little compensation for their war service. This time, it was different. King promised returning servicemen and women a generous training and financial package. He also supported family allowances to help large families avoid poverty. In early 1945, the Canadian Army was pushing its way north through the fields of Holland, up to the Rhine River and the German border.
We were advancing, and in front of us was the Hitler Youth. And they were, I'm sure, no more 14, 15, 16 years of age. Very, very arrogant, spit in your face. And a number of them had been captured. And it was just incredible. I still see them now, just those young kids, and with the feeling the way they did.
It was a difficult campaign, with the Germans defending behind canals, dikes, and flooded fields, but the Canadians pressed on. Thousands of Dutch civilians were dying of starvation as the Germans retreated, and the Canadian liberators were enthusiastically greeted. On April the 25th, 1945, Allied and Russian forces met on the Elbe River deep in Germany. A few days later, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin. Shortly after, the German troops in Holland surrendered to the Canadians. The war in Europe had been won. Though the Japanese were still fighting, victory in Europe, or VE Day, was a great victory.
Today is Victory in Europe Day. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
VE Day dawned. In London, capital of empire, Canadian service people joined their British buddies in the celebration of the great day. London lived in the front line. London rejoices in the defeat of a foe who came too close to their home. Hollanders, too, have real cause for celebration.
In the Pacific, the war continued. Plans were laid for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, and Canadian forces were preparing to join the assault. It was expected to be one of the bloodiest campaigns of the war. Allied commanders anticipated losing up to 1 million soldiers in the invasion, with much higher losses on the Japanese side. The American decision to drop the 2 atomic bombs forced the Japanese to surrender before any invasion happened. After 6 years and tens of millions of deaths, the Second World War was over.
I was in Britain. I was still in hospital, in fact, in a convalescent hospital. And it was just an enormous sense of relief, just a staggering weight and a staggering feeling that now one can get on with one's life. You know, in a sense, the war was a day-to-day, now experience, and one didn't think about things afterward. But comes the day when it's all over and you're in a sense free.
Thousands of soldiers returned home from service abroad. In 6 years, Canada had changed, but so had they. More than 1 million Canadians, a tenth of the population, served in the war. 730,000 joined the Army, 23,000 of whom lost their lives. 250,000 wore the Air Force uniform, and 17,000 of them were killed. By the end of the war, 113,000 Canadians had served in the Navy. 24 ships were sunk by the enemy, and 1,200 Navy personnel lost their lives. In all, more than 42,000 Canadians died in military service in the war. Less than in the First World War, but still a heavy loss of life. The nation had been split again by debate over conscription, but not as severely as in the First World War. Most importantly, Canadian society had been transformed. New roles for women had opened up. Canada now had a strong industrial base with the most modern technology and production methods. National pride and self-confidence were strengthened. At the end of World War I, Canada's independence was questioned by many other countries. After the Second War, no one could dispute that Canada had become a power in her own right. Canada was not a major world power, but it was clearly high in the ranks of the middle powers. The war had changed forever the lives of those who lived through it.
To me, the most dramatic experience was seeing some of my very good friends killed alongside me. That was probably the most dramatic thing. And once that happened, I said, gee, well, there's got to be a better way than this.